thanks ever so much, Richard, and also Kat as well, for the invitation, and thank you everybody for joining us today remotely. This is a topic which is very close to my heart, and Kat has just laid out a really excellent paper for us, which hopefully will dovetail reasonably nicely with some of what I'm about to cover in this paper. We switch focus geographically from Ireland to Britain, so we're moving eastwards, but we are staying more or less with the same time period in the 16th century, the early modern period. I'm sure many of you will be pleased to hear, for the early modernists. And the 16th century, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, is often seen by historians of cartography to be a really critical period in the development of maps and map making in Europe, with particular kinds of, in inverted commas, innovations, technological innovations. Kat's mentioned surveying technologies, print technologies would be another one. Of course, overseas European exploration as well, navigation, mathematical geography, you know, all of these things are in the kind of ether in the 16th century, and we see a huge outpouring of maps of all kinds, actually, not just world maps or local maps, all kinds of maps and plans, which leads some historians of maps and map making and geographers and so on to talk of this period as being something of a cartographic revolution, a revolution in maps and map making. So it's really clearly something we should be looking at in the way that Kat's been describing. And as she also highlighted, one of the paradoxes really is that although we have lots of maps from this period, we don't actually know much about how the maps themselves were being made. So the kind of reverse engineering approaches which we were just hearing about are really important to help begin to unlock some of the practices and processes by which these historic maps, these early modern maps, came to be, which is why I've called my paper An Ethnography of Cartography, because I think that leads us to think a little bit about these practices of maps and map making and the potential that 21st century geospatial technologies like GIS and others has for us to be able to understand something of that kind of cultural milieu, which was really clearly very important in enabling maps and map makers to operate and circulate and develop during the course of the 16th century. So we are looking today then, for me, to tracing early modern maps and map makers through geospatial technologies. And what I'm about to say leads from a number of projects, actually, some of which actually Kat herself has been closely involved with, and others as well. You see a whole raft of logos on this particular screen here. So what I'm going to do today is really pull together elements of these different projects funded over the years now, including the Goth map, which Richard mentioned, also the maps of Humphrey Floyd, which I'm going to focus on particularly today, and a project there called Mapping Lineages, which tries to develop some sort of genealogy of the development and evolution of historic maps of Great Britain, but analysing these using geographical information systems. And I'm working with Chris Brunsdon and Chris Lloyd on that particular project. So what I'm trying to do is synthesise some of this material today for us in this presentation, in this discussion. But before I kind of launch off into those various avenues and looking at the Goth map and so forth, I just thought it might be worth, and bearing in mind what we've just heard from Kat, to reflect a little bit about what's going on in the 16th century and that process, the set of practices by which these maps come to be in this period. And it is really a kind of combination really of map compilation and also field survey. So it's these two things working together, and that obviously is something which people would still relate to today in producing a map. It's often a previous map that's drawn upon for inspiration, sometimes quite literally, by copying it. In other cases, then there's new information brought in on that map from field survey or direct observation. This is William Cunningham's image of Norwich, which is actually where he was from in the east of England, in East Anglia, from a work called The Cosmographical Glass. which is from, as you can see, 1559. And the cosmographical glass was quite an interesting treatise on geography, on surveying, on mathematics, on astronomy, on cosmography. It was really quite typical of its age in many ways, in the kinds of things it brings together, interest in the world around us. And what I particularly like about this, it's not the best reproduction in the world. This is actually a map of Norwich, which you see in other cases being reproduced as a standalone map. But this particular version of it is embedded in the cosmographical glass, and it's there to serve a purpose, because what Cunningham is describing is the various methods and techniques which were available at the time for visualizing, for representing the world around us, for measuring it, for looking at angles, for surveying it, and so on and so forth. And the image itself, if you look at the very bottom there, you'll see two characters standing with, one of them has got dividers, a compass in his hand, the other one is pointing to the city in the distance. And, you know, this really, to me, captures the map and that field process hand in hand, and we actually see the people in the field, quite literally in a field outside Norwich there, you know, kind of implicated in the making of that image of the city, and they're standing there next to what probably is a plain table of some sort. So this connects us to perhaps something of the ethnography, the practices, the cultural milieu within which these map makers were operating and living in at the time, and the kind of knowledge that was being created and drawn upon into the map making process. But there's the compilation as well, the compilation of historic maps as well, which is part of that process. So there's a little quotation there from Chris Perkins from a really nice article where he talks about an ethnography of map making and the challenge that this presents to historians of cartography. You know, we don't have much paratext or context even for some of these maps. In fact, some of them are even anonymous, as we've just heard. And so the maps themselves are our kind of avenue into understanding something of those processes and practices, whether through field work or through compilation. So I'm interested in then is not only the survey work in the case of, as you just saw with Cunningham, and the kinds of processes and practices relating to field observation that Kat talked about, but also how the maps themselves can unlock something of their making, their compilation through reverse engineering. So this involves, to some extent, comparing maps. And this is really what I'm going to focus on today, is cartographic connections. The 16th century, as I've mentioned already, really is quite a critical period. We know of cartographers, we know of map makers, we know of their maps, or even though some of them are anonymous, and they appear to have, these are some of Great Britain, superficial resemblances. So on the left hand side there is the 14th century stroke 15th century Goth map at the Bodleian Library, University of Oxford, and you can begin to see some sort of superficial similarities reading across those maps of England mainly from the 16th century. So, you know, to what extent is one map influencing another one, influencing another? To what extent, for example, to put it another way, did George Lilley in 1546, who's actually working in Italy at that time, drawing upon other kinds of circulating maps, earlier maps, in order to try and create and compile a new map of Britain in 1546 in that particular case? And how did that process unfold? By what progress and by what means? You know, the map itself is complicated, is it not? You know, it's all sorts of visual information in there, geographical information about coastlines and so on. So we could disaggregate the map itself and think about its constituent elements and which parts might have been borrowed from which other maps. And this means really looking at similarities and differences between maps and thinking about genealogy, the linkages or lineages between maps and map makers over time. And we can do that qualitatively, as you'll see in a minute, but we can also begin to use our spatial technologies, geographic information systems, and the spatial data sets deriving from those to begin to quantify some of these similarities and differences. So these are our protagonists, these are our map makers, and as you can see, this actually comes from Catherine Delano Smith's and Roger Kane's book on English maps, which is very nice work actually. But it's a really lovely representation, I find, to kind of just emphasize the point how these were contemporaries. I'm going to focus particularly on Humphrey Cloyd, who you can see there second down in that list. But these were pretty much contemporaries with each other. I mean, it makes us wonder how much they might have interacted, connected, borrowed from each other, stolen from each other, how their maps might have circulated, who might have used them, and how they might have been used. So all sorts of, I think, really interesting questions actually about maps and map making in the early modern period, this really, really critical period that I've just mentioned earlier on. So it's a very useful chronology here, and identify some of our key players. And as I said, Humphrey Cloyd, I'm going to focus on particularly, not least because of the project, Inventor of Britain project with Philip Spitzer and Hugh Price, which is just coming to a close, which Kat Porter worked on with us. So the kind of approach that is often used for working out these connections between maps and map makers is illustrated here from Peter Barber's excellent piece in Amalgam Mundi on the Evesham World Map, where he's trying to deduce the ancestry, the ancestors of the Evesham World Map by comparing it to other maps in a qualitative sense and recreating a genealogy of the Evesham World Map to think about its parentage, if you like, where it might have come from. That's one way we can begin to think about connections between maps and map makers, and thinking about the connections across time as well as space. These sort of family resemblances that we might see in the features that a particular map shows, the coastlines, the places, and so on and so forth. We can also perhaps use another kind of metaphor to think about a map having an archaeology, how we might begin sort of peel away those layers, those map features, to excavate the map itself, to look at its content, and to think about how the stratigraphy of the map might tell a story about how the map was made. So what we want to try and do then is access those map layers to think about not just the sequence of maps over time as a sort of stratigraphy, but compressed within each individual map are these different layers. The roads, the coastlines, the rivers, the topographical features, and so on and so forth. You know, these are layers. So one of the things we can begin to do in a geographical information system, in the way that Kat described, is disaggregate those layers, to separate those layers out as vector layers within the geographical information system. So this is the Anglia Figura map, which Peter Barber's done a lot of work on at the British Library. And what we've got here then is the layer, the islands, first of all, as you can see, then the rivers and coastlines, and then the places, the yellow dots, so all the places, the points on the map. And so we can begin to do this for a whole sequence of maps of Great Britain, and this is what we've been working on through mapping lineages with Chris Lloyd and Chris Brunsdon and others as well. So this is the Gough map from an earlier project I worked on with Chris and others, where we've done exactly the same thing. You know, we've separated the map feature. I should say, it was reminding me when Kat was talking about the live map being Ireland viewed from Britain, we could talk about the Gough map being Britain viewed from Ireland, because this is how the Gough map it represents Great Britain, as it were, on its side. So it's actually orientated with the east to the top, as you can see there. But the different features, the rivers, the cartouches, the islands, and so on and so forth, we can disaggregate these things. This is the point. One of the important parts of that disaggregation process then are the points on the map. And this is really what Kat was describing as well, but this for the Gough map, we end up with two sets of coordinate data for each of these points on the map. We have the point in terms of its map space, as it were. So we're using the measurements of the map itself within the GIS. And we also, because it's a real place in the real world, that particular place also has a geographical coordinate. So this just illustrates that for the Gough map for Kingston upon Thames, for Hull, Kingston upon Hull as it is now. Kingston upon Hull in the northeast of England, not Kingston upon Thames. So that particular point has two sets of coordinates on the Gough map and from the modern map. And then we can begin to perform some statistical analyses, regression analyses, dimensional regression analyses, and linear regression analyses in the way that Kat was describing, And what we begin to see here is then sometimes a strong fit or strong correlation between the way the historic map represents the locations of those places and how they are located today using those geographical coordinates. And we can separate out the X and Y coordinates and indeed bring the two things together. So that's something of the, I suppose, the methods of the technique, which really relates to what we were just hearing about a little while ago. How might we begin to use those methods then to try and understand something of the compilation process? And here we're going to turn to two maps by Humphrey Llwyd, both of which appear in Ortelius's Teatrum Orbis Terrarum, and both published and printed posthumously. So Llwyd himself died in 1568. So these maps, the one here, Cambria Tipus, both of them are in the National Library and other places now, National Library of Wales, I should say. Both have been reasonably well studied over the years, but there's a kind of uncertainty really about how Llwyd himself compiled these maps, whether he went to different sources, whether he worked locally, and this is the earliest map to show Wales as an independent or a separate entity, geographical entity. And we know Llwyd was traveling a lot in Europe, which, you know, is how he got to know Ortelius or how Ortelius got to know him. So, you know, in what ways are these different influences exerting themselves upon this map, the Cambria Tipus of Wales, this 1573 map of Wales? So the analytical methods that we were just hearing about can be drawn in here. So the Cambria Tipus itself, would we begin to think about those same displacement vectors which Cap was talking about using Map Analyst, we can begin to see here how there are certain displacements of places, particularly in the southwest of Wales and northeast of Wales around Anglesey, if you know your geography of Wales. But equally, there's also quite a lot of consistency in the positioning of places on the Cambria Tipus map compared to modern coordinate space. Which in itself is kind of interesting. It tells us something of how that map was perhaps compiled through field work, and the geography of settlements which are shown on the map is shown on the right hand side there, and there's a kind of interesting geography to those places as shown on the map. Llwyd himself was from the northeast of Wales, so one might expect the northeast of Wales to be rather better mapped, better represented, more places, and so on. So we begin to relate the map to the person, and I think that's really important if we're trying to recreate our ethnography. The distortion grid obviously tells a similar kind of, it's another output from Map Analyst using the same data set. You know, it tells an interesting story in itself, and unlike the displacement vectors, I suppose it's just another way of visualizing similar kind of information, but we can begin to use that, the warp and the weft of that grid, the distortion grid itself, to see something of, again, Anglesey looked particularly, and also the Llyn Peninsula to the southwest of Snowdonia seemed to have a heightened amount of distortion compared to other parts of the map further south, for example, places away from where Llwyd himself was from. We can actually juxtapose that grid onto the map itself. So Ortelius received this information from Llwyd, but we don't actually know how Llwyd came about with this map, came to create this map, and what sources were important in it. And as you can see from the letter that he wrote to Ortelius just before his death, he died in 1568, how he sent the map of Wales, not beautifully set forth in all points, yet truly depainted, so that certain notes be observed. The thing is, because this map appears in the Teatrum of 1573, there's then 5 years, and we just do not know necessarily what influence Ortelius himself may have had on these maps. So the other map is this one, which is of England and Wales. So this is the Anglia Regni map, as it's called. Another map which appears to have been sent to Ortelius, and there's a little quotation there from that same letter. He seemed to have sent 3 maps, 1 of Wales and 2 of England. And this one is the other England drawn forth perfectly enough, I suspect, because it doesn't have the ancient names that are mentioned on that letter. So again, you know, this is an interesting map to think about, and just comparing the Cambria Tipus map by Llwyd with his other map, the Anglia Regni, and look at how Wales is represented. There are differences. In the Anglia Regni map, the map of England and Wales, there's much more displacement visible. in the placement of places for Wales itself, as you can see by these arrows here, compared to the Cambriotepus, which is curious, is it not? You know, we've got two representations of Wales by a Welshman in Ortelius's atlas, and yet the maps are not the same. It's not, he hasn't copied himself, in other words. He hasn't used the same sources for the Cambriotepus and the Anglo-Regni map, even though he's representing Wales on both. So that makes us then perhaps think a little bit, I'm drawing to a close here now, it makes us think a little bit about that wider picture, about this ethnography, about the practices, but also the contacts, the networks, the interrelationships between Clwyd and his contemporaries. And here we might point to some of those on that list, in particular Lawrence Knoll. Lawrence Knoll was a contemporary of Clwyd, and as you can see from this brief sort of extract of their itineraries, were certainly moving around Europe, as many of these Renaissance polymaths were, educating themselves and visiting various sites around Europe at that particular period. So they may well have been crossing paths, may well have been interrelating, interconnecting. They were both also actually serving the Parliament of Elizabeth in 1559, as you can see there as well, from different parts of the country, different parts of Britain, different parts of England, but nevertheless at the same Parliament. So again, it just makes us wonder what kind of connections there might be between these individuals and what influence they may have had on each other. Can we detect any of that copying or connectivity between these maps and map makers? So this is the Lawrence Knoll map from 1564, around about the same sort of time, and as you can see shows Great Britain and also Ireland. So this is one of the maps we've done some analyses of. So using these displacement vectors very simply here, what we've done, this is some work that Kat and Chris Lloyd and I have been working on, and Chris Brunsdon. We've begun to look at the map, the Clwyd map, the Anglo-Figura map, in relation to other maps of Great Britain of that same time. And where we get very short vectors, you can begin to see perhaps a kind of closer relationship between Clwyd and those other maps. So there's not much of a close relationship between the Clwyd map and the Anglo-Figura in 1537 or Lilley's map. But by the time we get to Knoll, certainly for England, there seems to be quite a strong element of consistency in the placement of places, but not for Wales, interestingly enough. Whereas Saxton, which is slightly later, of course, we have a much more close connection between those places. So we can begin to compare these different maps and think about what this might mean for us. And for Clwyd's map, it seems to be most like Knoll and also Saxton as well. I'm sure it should be 1579, not 1559. And using the stats which lie behind these calculations, then we can begin to use bidimensional regression, which I must admit is not my field of expertise. So Kat might be able to help me out here if there's any complicated questions. But what I do know is that the values on the right hand side, the closer to 1, the stronger the correlation. So again, Clwyd and Knoll's maps look quite close compared to Lilley and the Anglo-Figura. So again, suggesting there's differences and similarities between Clwyd and Knoll, and dissimilarities between Clwyd, Lilley and the Anglo-Figura. And Kat has also worked on some other ways of visualizing these connections, which is really more or less where I want to end on here. So this is just another set of visualizations, those sort of diagrams there, of thinking about the linkages, the possible connections between particular maps, those of Humphrey Clwyd in this particular case, and those of his contemporaries. Another way of visualizing that statistical information. So what does this point then to? Well, I think what it shows fundamentally is that we can use the maps themselves as sources, excavating those maps, thinking about the archaeology of cartography, to get them back into something of the practices, the connections, the networks of those maps and map makers from the 16th century, to try and understand the cultural milieu, this ethnography of cartography of that particular period, and question bigger kind of challenges really about, well, how much are these maps really changing over time? Are we really looking here at a cartographic revolution? How much borrowing, in other words, was there going on? How much innovation was there going on? but also methodological spin-offs from this as well, insights that this provides to us in spatial analysis and geographic information systems. I'm 5 minutes over my time, for which I apologise, but I will just end with the many acknowledgements and my thanks to all the collaborators and the funders as well, without whom this would not have been possible. Thanks.